All right, so we finished up our introductory material last week. Just to bring you up to speed, what we covered there quickly at the end, why Jesus asked questions was sort of the summary statement to cause people to think and to reason, to clarify a certain idea or teaching, to get people to respond or get them involved in a discussion, to emphasize or to draw attention to something, to remind his listeners about some matter, to cause people to be convicted in their hearts about something, some particular matter or teaching, without him necessarily saying it directly. And number 7, to motivate people to do the right thing. And then 8, to provide, to instruct or provide some new instruction. So that was kind of what we covered quickly there at the end of class. And then to remind you of our approach to each one of these questions. The way we will do it, we'll look at the question and we'll ask some questions about the question. One of the things that we'll ask, to whom was Jesus speaking when he asked each question? We want to look at, of course, what was the setting, what was the context of the question. That's going to tell us a lot, of course, what's going on at the time of that question. And then we'll look at what was the application for the person or persons to whom the question was asked. And then, of course, we want to wrap it up by what application can we get or what application can we make from that question and really particularly the answer to the question. So, that all having been said, let's turn over to Matthew. And I don't remember if I said this last week or not, but some of these questions will be repeated and maybe even in slightly different form in a different gospel account. And for those, we won't cover them twice. If it's a different question, then yes, we will. Sometimes in a parallel account, there may be a question recorded by Matthew that's not recorded by Luke, or vice versa. John, Mark, same thing. If it's a different question, an additional question, we'll cover that. But if it's the same question being asked in Matthew and in Luke or Mark or John, we won't cover it twice because we will already have plowed that ground, so to speak. So Matthew chapter 5. First question we run across is in the context of right on the heels of the Beatitudes. After he gives these kingdom attitudes, as sometimes people have all kind of different descriptions that they've given of these Beatitudes. But verse 13 is the first question we run across. You're the salt of the earth, but, here's your question, if the salt have lost his savor, wherewith shall it be salted? Well, if the salt, some versions have, loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? I believe, let's pull up the New King James here so I can compare on the fly. I believe that's how the New King James has it. Yes, if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? ESV has, if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? Well, who is he asking this question to? This is to a multitude. This is not speaking, of course, we already talked about one of the things that made Jesus such a great teacher. He had no problem talking to individuals one-on-one, back and forth type dialogue, but he also had no problem and often did speak to multitudes in a lecture style format, and that's kind of what he's doing here. But one of the things that can be lost in a lecture type setting is that back and forth dialogue, but one of the ways that you could kind of get as near to that as possible is asking questions. And so sometimes Jesus, even when speaking to multitudes, he would ask a question and then answer it. So he's speaking here to the multitudes within the Sermon on the Mount. Of course, Matthew 5 through 7 is the overall context of the Sermon on the Mount. What is the setting here or the context? Well, he's just given the Beatitudes. He's talked about these attitudes, kingdom attitudes, attitudes that we ought to be having. In fact, that's one description I've heard of a preacher make one time talking about the Beatitudes. They're attitudes you ought to be having. So we've talked before about the idea of blessed, makarios in the Greek. It's not really best translated as happy, because happy can be a temporary thing. This is more like joy. It's something that goes a lot deeper than just happiness of the moment or a state of mind, a state of heart that is based on what's happening to me at the time. Happiness can be, somebody says, well, hey, you look nice today. You're happy. Oh, thank you very much. And the next, might turn right around and somebody else says, well, you're looking rough today. And then all of a sudden you're not so happy. Happiness kind of can fluctuate like that. But this state of blessedness, this idea of being blessed is far deeper than that. So the context here is just on the heels of that. Now Jesus is going to talk about how God's people need to be displaying these attitudes in the world and making a difference, influencing the world. And that gets us kind of to the application for them, and really for us, the applications here are the same. Sometimes you'll see there's a slight difference in what was the application for the one or ones to whom Jesus asked the question versus us. But here it's the same. It's the same thing. So what use does salt have in our lives? Talking about literal, physical salt. Do what? It often preserves. It's used. It's still used, but especially in the old days, before we had all the modern ways of preserving things, you have salt-cured pork, salt-cured meats, things like that. So there's preserving. What else? Do what? Flavor, taste, yes. A lot of times we may taste something and say, well, it needs salt. It gives flavor, right? And that's probably the most familiar use to us for salt. What else? Yeah, you can use it on icy roads to help melt the ice, or steps. Sometimes people use it on steps and things like it. Do what? Yeah, there can be
It's very much part of our body.
yeah, there's
It's also used in a lot of products like your eyes.
saline solution for your eyes. That's right. So yeah, there's actually a lot of. We talked about that just a little bit in the Science in the Bible lesson, because we're looking at all these different temperatures on planets, and one of the planets being so hot, I was looking, thinking in terms of this substance would melt if there, mercury would boil if there, and I thought, what about blood? But blood is so much water that it's about the same boiling temperature as water, but it does have a little bit of salt, and said it's about a 2% difference. But yeah, it does. It has a healing effect as well, and yeah, Miss Tammy mentioned sometimes you get a sore in your mouth or something, you can wash it out with salt water, and that helps. A lot of times, my kids and I, we use pickle juice, but because it's so salty, but it doesn't taste as yucky as just plain old salt water. I guess if you like pickles, it doesn't taste as yucky. Maybe it's worse if you don't like pickles. But there's another one that I thought of. Have you ever had, in fact, maybe it's a sore in the mouth. I remember several years ago in Chattanooga, I was out at the little hockey rink they've got downtown and was playing, and some guy got in front of me or something. It was just one of those things where I barely even had time to react. And I just barely turned, or I might have lost teeth, and I got hit right there with a hockey puck. And it thankfully, being an inline hockey puck, not an ice hockey puck, or I probably would have lost teeth either way. But man, it gashed right here on the outside, but it also, of course, it smashes against your teeth, and it cut me on the inside. And for, I don't know, a week or two, your mouth heals pretty quickly. I think there's a lot of blood vessels in there that contributes to that. But for about a week, every time I ate anything, you know what happened? Oh, it was painful. It didn't stop me from eating, just to be clear. But it was painful because salt, it preserves, it flavors, but it also irritates sometimes, right? You get a sore, and in fact, there's an expression we often use. I don't want to rub salt in the wound. Maybe somebody's already down and you give them some bad news, or maybe they've already been criticized and somebody's criticizing them further. And hey, let's don't rub salt in the wound here, because it irritates, and that's important because Christians are to add flavor to the world, to preserve in the sense of helping to preserve godliness and righteousness in this world. But is it not a fact that sometimes Christians irritate those in the world? Now, sometimes a Christian can irritate somebody just by being a rude, obnoxious person and not acting very much like a Christian, right? That does happen as well. What we're talking about, though, you think about Jesus. Jesus never did anything wrong. Did he ever irritate people? I mean, there were people that got so irritated with him they wanted to kill him. And eventually, at the behest, the Romans, at the behest of those people, did end up putting him on a cross. So salt can, it preserves, it flavors. How would Christians flavor like salt in the world? What do we mean by that? Yeah, and that's what he's talking about here, influence. Influencing others. Christians, people ought to look at Christians and see folks who are living a better life. They are people that they're not immune from difficulty. They're not immune from suffering, tragedy even. And yet, they can endure, and they don't enjoy it, but they understand that there's something more to this life. And people take notice of that. Maybe they see somebody who, of course, we're going to get into this a little bit later in chapter 5, maybe they see somebody who is mistreated, hated, and instead of hating back, they love. They try to help. They try to do something to encourage them to do what's right and not to be such a mean, nasty person. That's, there's so many different ways we could talk about how Christians influence this world, but those are just a few. We are to influence others in a positive way, and that's what he's talking about here. Of course, he's going to go on to say that if the salt if it's lost its savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It's thenceforth good for nothing but to be cast out and to be trodden under foot of men. Well, nobody wants to be good for nothing, right? In fact, that's one of the worst things you could say to somebody if you wanted to insult them. You're just good for nothing. But if a Christian is not flavoring the world, influencing the world for good, preserving that attitude and way of godliness in this world and striving to live like Jesus, it's a telling statement, isn't it? It ought to be very sobering to us. If I'm not doing that, if I'm not living my life in such a way as to influence others toward God, well, what am I doing? What am I good for in the kingdom? It's not to say I'm just, you're worthless and should be written off, but it ought to get my attention and make me do some self-examination and think, okay, maybe I need to make some changes. And that's sadly so often the case, isn't it? I mean, we see Christians, and sometimes you can't tell the difference between Christians and non-Christians. Sometimes you can go into a crowd, you can look at how the people are dressed. You can't tell the difference. Sometimes you start talking to people, you can't tell the difference in the speech between the Christians and the non-Christians. Overall behavior, sometimes you just can't tell the difference. that's a problem, right? We need to be salt, we need to be light, and that goes on into verse 14. You're the light of the world. A city that's set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, or under a basket, we might say. In fact, that's what ESV and New King James both have. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand. It gives light to all who are in the house. And of course, he goes on, and there in verse 16, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. It's not our light that they're seeing. We're reflecting the light of the Father. That's the way it's supposed to be, at least, right? So if I wear Jesus' name, he wants me to be a positive influence on others, to let them know I'm his, to live a godly life, and to try to teach others, to try to make more disciples for Jesus. I can't just depend on influence alone. At some point, I have to talk to them about the gospel. Sometimes people, we say this so often, balance is one of the most difficult things in life, and sometimes we go to one extreme where we say, I'm going to live a godly life. And I'm going to strive to be like Jesus and be a good influence, but I don't ever talk to anybody about the gospel. I don't ever talk to anybody about what it means to be a Christian or how to become a Christian, but I'm a good influence. Well, that's great, but there's another side to it. Now, sometimes people go to the other extreme, right? And I've seen it before where people are talking to others a lot sometimes. You need to be a Christian, but then they're not living it. And you talk about a message that will fall on deaf ears. I heard Cliff Goodwin say it one time. It's just one of those sayings that stuck with me. He says, the world may not know anything about the scriptures, but there's one thing they will recognize, fast, and that is a hypocrite. And so the balance is being salt, being light in our influence, but also talking to others about the gospel, because it is possible to become a good-for-nothing disciple. But I don't have to stay that way. I can change. There's a statement Jesus makes over in John 15 in the context of talking about the vine and the branches. It reminds us of this passage here in Matthew 5. Of course, he begins that chapter, I am the true vine, my Father is the husbandman. But notice what he says in the next verse. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit, he cuts off, or taketh away, the King James has. And every branch that beareth fruit, he purgeth it, that it may bring forth more fruit. Now you're clean through the word which I have spoken unto you. Abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, except you abide in the vine. No more can ye, except it abide in the vine. No more can ye, except ye abide in me. I'm the vine, you're the branches. He that abideth in me, and I in him, the same bringeth forth much fruit, for without me ye can do nothing. Listen to verse 6. If a man abide not in me, he is cast forth as a branch and is withered. And men gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned. I saw a discussion just recently, I think it was on Facebook, and comments of some post that somebody had made. But it was a denominational fellow that he kept accusing, I think it was Brother Aaron Gallagher from GBN, who's scheduled to come and do our Men's Day this year. But this guy was accusing Aaron. He says, you don't even believe Mark 16:16. Of course, he differed with Aaron. It really differed with the Bible, because Aaron just quoted the verse. Mark 16:16, Jesus says, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be condemned. You don't even believe that, because you think a Christian can lose his salvation. If Jesus says, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, that's it. But is that all Jesus ever had to say about it? Yeah, if you believe and you're baptized, you'll be saved. But can I choose to walk away? Jesus sometimes talks, in fact, John 10, he's going to talk about he's the good shepherd. No man can pluck his sheep out of his hand. And that's true. Nobody can forcefully remove you from being a child of God. But what if I just decide to walk away because I don't want to be salt. I don't want to be light anymore. I want to just do my own thing. I want to live my life the way I want to live it. Well, sure, I could walk away. And so Jesus talks about that in John 15 as well. So if I wear the name of Christ, he wants me to be positive influence on others, to let them know I'm his disciple, and to live a godly life, and to try to teach others to do the same. That's the idea here with this question in Matthew 5:13. Anything else on that before we move to the next question? Yes, sir.
People who hire teachers for public schools recognize the value of good character. A lot of times they look for Christian type people because they have learned through the years they have an enduring type character. Now, I will say, as a teacher myself for 33 years, you know, you stand in front of people and you teach a level. People who do that day after day, day after day, day after day. I mean, I realized I had to change, you know, in some things, but it's really your character that's a big part of your influence. And if you are, if I'm teaching math and I make a lot of math mistakes, it doesn't work. You know,
Right.
you got to be confident. But the role of a teacher in a classroom among people, you immediately have an influence the first day. And it's up to you if you're going to keep that or not. And things will come up, like parents, things come up with your kids. Things come up in a classroom, and you cannot say, I'll only deal with that. You're going to have to learn to deal with a lot of things, and it shows what you're made out of. And students remember that. They may not remember that geometry equation, but they'll remember that adult. And that goes to show the importance of an adult's influence and the value of teachers in public schools or any kind of school.
Influence is so important, and most of us have probably seen the illustration. Used to be in an email forward. Now you see it a lot on social media, but where it'll say something like, "Name the last 5 years winners of the World Series." I don't know that I could get beyond, this most recent. Usually, if the Braves don't make it or they get out, I'm kind of like, I don't really care. Name the last 5 winners of the Super Bowl. Name the last 5 winners of the Stanley Cup. Even sports that you're into and you watch a lot, it gets hard to go back beyond just, maybe a year or two. But then, the little thing goes on to say, now name 5 teachers. A lot of times it's using teachers. Name 5 teachers in your life that had a really big impact. And I remember the first time I ran across that, it listed 2 or 3 of the major sports. And I think I may have gotten 1 in a couple of those categories. I had no idea. But then it says, think of 5 teachers. And I'm thinking, I had a couple from high school, I had a couple from like middle school age, and a few from, in fact, I had way more than 5 that influenced me. And then I even think to preaching school, really every one of my instructors influenced me tremendously in preaching school. And the point of that whole exercise was to show that has so much more of an impact, and yet we place so much emphasis sometimes. We get so worked up over sports, and we get so into that, even sometimes to the neglect of spiritual things, that we forget what's really important. I think even back to my formative years, some of the teachers I had in Bible classes and the influence they had on me, it was just tremendous. When I obeyed the gospel, that was one of the few times, really the only time I can recall in my life, when my mom let me make a phone call to someone at like 10:30, 10:45 at night. That was just, you didn't do that. She would just, I'd have to get special permission, even like my friends. If she comes in and you're chatting on the phone, it's 10:30, what do you think you're doing? That was just mom's rule, like 10 o'clock was the cutoff. But the night I obeyed the gospel, I had to call Brother Joe Wayne and tell him, because he had been my Bible class teacher. I might have still been my teacher at that time. I can't recall, but I just remember every time we come into class, he'd say, "All right, folks, at some point, beginning or end of class, he'd say, tell me how to become a Christian. And he'd kind of role play with us a little bit, and he'd say, well, now, hold on. Because as kids, we sometimes, hear a believer, repent, confess, be baptized. He'd say, well, now, you got to show me that in the Bible. And we'd have to, give him a verse. And show him from the Bible where that's what you need to do to become a Christian. And it made an impact on me. And like I said, that was the first person I wanted to call. I remember several sisters who taught me as just a young fella. And I can still, at 46 years of age, I can still hear them talking and going over some of those things in my mind. And it does. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. Be influence in the world. And even in the sports world, you hear a lot of talk about this. I read an article, it's been a few years ago, at the draft, a lot of NFL, what do you call them? Not recruiters. But the guys that are looking at the players, I don't know why I can't think of the scouts. Thank you. Good night. I could not come up with that word. A lot of the scouts they're looking at certain players, but they're also trying to find out about some character. Because what they've learned is sometimes the most talented guy has rotten character, and it's not going to translate. And you're going to have problems with that guy. I don't think they do near as good a job with it as they probably should, but it just goes to show it. And even in the secular workforce, people will never say, hey, we're looking for a Christian. But a lot of times the stuff that they say pertaining to character, I just want to say, well, what you're looking for here is a faithful Christian. That's who you need to be hiring. And, of course, sadly, sometimes those who are wearing the name of Christian and have obeyed the gospel of Christ don't fit the bill. And Jesus is saying, if that's the case, don't be a good-for-nothing disciple. Make the changes, be salt, be light. So, good thoughts there. All right, let's drop down to verse 46 for the next question here. This is still in the context of the Sermon on the Mount. So the audience would be the multitudes. He says, for if you love them which love you, what reward have ye? And really two questions here, because he goes on to say, do not even the publicans the same? And of course we have another question right here in the context. And if you salute your brethren only, what do you more than others? Do not even the publicans so? So he says, if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the publicans or the tax collectors the same? Well, the contrast really begins back up in verse 43. And, of course, in this context, you see a lot of, you've heard that it hath been said, but I say unto you. Jesus may expound on the teaching from the law or show how they had misinterpreted or changed that teaching, attempted to change it at least. He says in verse 43, you've heard that it hath been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. Well, that's not what the law said, of course, but he says that's what you've heard others say. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. And then, of course, he asks the question that we're looking at. Is it wrong to love those who love us? No. That's the way it should be, right? I mean, think about a husband and wife, close friends. There are lots of folks who love us in our lives, and it's not, well, I'm not going to love you because, Jesus says, if you love those who love you, what reward have you? He's not saying don't love those who love you. The idea here is don't love just those who love you. Because, a lot of the most worldly people, if you're nice to them, well, good morning. Some people are just kind of grumpy and may not be too friendly back. But I dare say most people, how are you today? I'm doing good. How are you doing? But if you get on the wrong side of that person, watch out, right? He's saying, don't be like that. You love everybody, even those who mistreat you. And I was looking back, going through some stuff for this particular question, and I was looking at some of my old sermon notes back when I preached through. It was a Sermon on the Mount. As I pointed out already, this was kind of a it was a misrepresentation of what the old law said. The old law said, Leviticus 19:18, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Let me just pull that up so I don't misquote it and butcher it. 19:18. Read it from the New King James. Did I get that right? Yeah. You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Well, they added something to it, right? Love your neighbor as yourself and hate your enemy. Well, the law never said that. They added that. And so they had misrepresented, in many ways, the law, at least on that aspect of it. But he's dealing here with how do we behave toward those who hate us. And again, looking at some of my notes on the Sermon on the Mount, I was thinking about this in terms of verse 44. Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. There are three aspects of hatred that he addresses here. He says, those who hate you, this would be a matter of the heart. And you know, sometimes that's just in a look. We sometimes say, "Ooh, man, if looks could kill." And we even say sometimes, well, if looks could kill, I would have dropped dead right then and there. Because that look he gave me or that look she gave me. He says, return that with love. That's what God did, right? He demonstrates his love toward us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And look, it's not saying somebody that hates you is you just got to make them your best friend. But it's this idea of agape love. I want what is best for them. We sometimes even will say, you know, I wouldn't want that for my worst enemy. Well, how much more so should that statement be true when it comes to eternal condemnation? I don't want that for anybody. And so, if nothing else, I can be nice to somebody based on that. Hate is powerful, and it can destroy you, and it will destroy you if you let it, inside and out. But love is more powerful. It's got power to heal, to build up. So he talks about the aspect of the heart, those who hate you. Then he says those who curse you. This would be what? Speech, right? Maybe somebody just talks ugly to you. Or maybe somebody talks ugly about you. This may or may not be to your face. And so sometimes, if Brother Robert is nice to me, I'm nice right back. But maybe he says something to me that I don't like. Might even be he says something just downright mean and unkind. How do I respond to that? Or what if he says something and I find out, did you hear what Robert said about you? How do I react then? Some people, it'll change their whole attitude and how they treat that person. Well, Christians do more. We don't do that. We return it with blessing. What kind of answer turns away wrath? Proverbs 15:1, a soft answer. But he goes on to say, grievous words stir up strife. When reviled, 1 Peter 2:21 through 23 or so, Jesus, he did not revile in return, the text says, but he committed to himself to him that judgeth righteously. And so, Christians, if somebody curses me to my face, I don't have to curse them back. I've even heard Christians say sometimes, maybe they were driving down the road, somebody gave me this obscene gesture, I gave it right back. Like, what? And that's not the Christian way to do things. Man, he said this to me. He said, I can't stand you. I told him, I can't stand you either. Well, that's Christians do more than that. When Jesus was reviled, he didn't say, well, I don't really like y'all too much, none either. He prayed for them, even from the cross as he's being crucified. He wanted what was best for them. So that's when the aspect of speech. And then he talks about those who persecute you, despitefully use you and persecute you. This will be in action. So you got the aspect of the heart, might even be just a nasty look. You just know that person doesn't like you. They may not be just chewing you out to your face or running around just talking about you nonstop, but you just know that person does not like you. How do I respond to that? Maybe they say something ugly to me or about me. How do I respond to that? This third aspect is action. Maybe they do something. Open, outright hatred. How do I respond to that as a Christian? Well, I've shared with you before the illustration of the drill sergeant. In fact, I had that. I wanted to make sure. I thought I had that in my notes. I didn't want to mess up the illustration, but there was the story told of a drill sergeant in the Army that he was known for being just a mean, nasty person, and he kind of changed, and so a lot of folks talked about it. What brought about that change? And somebody in talking to him one day asked him about that, and he talked about a private. He was in basic, and it'd been real nasty, rainy, muddy outside. They come in, and this private would get down every night. At the end of his bed, he would get down on his knees and he would pray before he would get in his bunk. And the story was told that the drill sergeant one night was just in a particularly bad mood, and it annoyed him for some reason, and he took his nasty, muddy boot and he slung it at him and hit him right upside the head. And just kind of satisfied with himself. Nothing was said, nothing happened. He was sort of, I got him, and he went to sleep. And he woke up the next morning with his boots spit shined, perfectly clean. That private had returned a curse with a blessing. And the drill sergeant went on to say, that shamed me. And I really got to thinking about my attitude and how I conduct myself. How do we respond to those who hate us and treat us like dirt? This is agape love, wanting what's best for people. All right, we're out of time. We'll pick up there and have a few thoughts here on the other questions in 47 and pick up there, God willing, next week. Thank y'all so much. Looking forward to going through more of these questions of Jesus. We'll have a short break before our worship period today.